Thank you very much, Veronica. And I have the really great pleasure to chair this panel, but also the challenge of asking a lot of exciting questions to 4 of our panelists within 20 minutes. So I will try to keep this very short at the beginning. So we are very fortunate to have Kanwal Bhatia with us. For those who didn't join at the beginning, Kanwal is the founder of AIVAL, a startup providing software for the evaluation of healthcare AI products. We have Sara Gerke, assistant professor of law at Penn State Dickinson Law, focusing on the ethical and legal challenges of healthcare AI. We have Sanmi, who just gave his very nice presentation, assistant professor in the Department of Computer Science at Stanford, interested in developing principles and practice of trustworthy ML. And we have the great pleasure to have Judy now joining us, Judy Gichoya. Many of you will know her. She gave an excellent keynote at our in-person FAIMI at MICAI. She's an assistant professor at Emory University, a clinician, interventional radiologist in radiology and informatics, focusing on validating machine learning models, and is very much interested in real-world performance, exploring explainability, fairness, and how algorithms fail. So thank you all to all 4 for joining us. Before we go into some questions, I just want to very briefly share our panel poll. So this is what the audience thought we should talk about. So there are a couple of questions and you will see the responses. I will try to do this relatively quick. So we did ask what means fair in the context of AI in medical imaging. So we'll share this beautiful word cloud, something to look at, keywords, unbiased, transparency, equitable coming out here. We did ask what are the biggest barriers, challenges in algorithmic fairness, and number 1 is lack of appropriate data, so we can talk about that as well. Should fairness analysis or discussion be mandatory? And maybe that connects to Sammy's last point, where he said we really should think more about, like everyone should think about, how do we do this and how do we integrate fairness assessment? So there is a majority that says, yes, this should be mandatory in research papers. Now, a little bit more on the legislation, and really keen to hear Sarah's thoughts on this as well. Do you think government should legislate and to ensure AI fairness? There's a majority of saying yes. What form should such legislation take? You can see there's a lot of variability here, and maybe that is something to look at as well. Should healthcare AI be open source? That's a contentious topic. There's a lot of discussion about open sourcing LLM models, so maybe we can pick up on that. And you see the audience is split here a little bit. Then there was a question, so this is interesting because this is primarily attended by Europeans. So are you aware of President Biden's executive order for AI? The majority was not aware, so that might be interesting for our US colleagues. And the last question we asked was weighing the risks and opportunities. Is medical imaging AI ready for clinical use today? And as anticipated, the majority says it depends, let's discuss. And that's exactly what we're going to do now in the panel. So I would like to pick up on that question, on the last point that Sanmi made in his talk. Should it be mandatory? Should papers be rejected if there isn't a proper analysis of bias and fairness? Maybe Sanmi, I can give that to you first, and then others can chip in.
It's I think a challenging one because of the tension in I think what we think we're doing and sort of the impacts that it has. I'd say, and I said some version of this, and I was on a panel at ICML on sort of social impacts. I think, you know, if we are building tools that affect people, we should be thinking about the social impacts, and those should be sort of evaluated and measured somehow. And so, you know, the answer that you need to give maybe is like whether you agree that your tool affects people or not. And if you think it does, then we should be meaningfully engaging on this question of sort of what potential disparate impacts and other kinds of issues downstream might be. And so from that view, I'm partial to maybe going in the direction of sort of more measurement and it being part of just the sort of expectation for papers. There's some trickiness in, you know, exact norms and governance and sort of requirement and all that I want to think about it a little bit more, only because I've never thought about it before. But I think it's a fascinating question, and actually one that might be meaningful to, yeah, I think it's an interesting question.
And I guess we have seen some progress now. A lot of AI papers, conferences require you to at least have a statement, which I think is already something that is
right. Make sure you consider these questions.
Exactly. Maybe I can take my next question. I would like to ask Judy, and then maybe also Kanwal on this one. And it came up in the earlier discussions. Do we care about generalization? No. Or is local validation all we need?
I think as we get to real world validation, we are finding new lessons. And you know, when I think about the value, so like in my institution, we deploy 2 AI systems for radiology. One is a stroke large vessel occlusion system, and the second one is a triage system. If you look at the true value, and I think Sanmi also alluded it to at the end, is that, you know, initially people thought, well, you're going to make radiologists better. AI has I can say this boldly, has shown that using AI at radiology saved a patient's life, really. It's because everyone is short-staffed. They have many patients on the queue. They those AI systems are bumping patients up, and it doesn't matter if they're wrong, but you don't want to be embarrassed calling a patient 1 week later, oh, you have a GI bleed that we've been sitting on for days, right? And that's been one clear metric, even if that was not the intended use. The second area, there's an interesting, I gave a recent lecture, and there's an interesting product that when you sort of dictate your findings before you come to impression, which is like, okay, what's my summary and what's the question I'm answering? What I noticed with that point was that the radiologist said that AI, even if it's not very accurate and they end up changing what the impression is, gives them like a mental break to just take like a second that allows their productivity to be better. And then someone else said, well, the summary sometimes can say light effusion, and then they realize, oh, I dictated it wrong because I meant a left effusion. So this type of value metrics, and if we know that the AI, we're seeing automation bias based on the output of AI, are very difficult, and they're very institutional dependent. And I do believe even some of the earlier work that is coming out, where we're seeing even challenges that if Sanmi says a model is fair, it doesn't necessarily mean it's fair for my group. It's going to challenge this myth of trying to get the most generalizable model, in my opinion.
So these must be things, Kanwal, you're thinking about day and night now. Regarding local validation in particular, what are your thoughts on this, Kanwal?
I mean, my opinion is that local validation is essential. In terms of whether generalization is important, I think it's really important to understand, to know what your product can do and what it cannot do. And I think this audience is, you know, quite experienced, both technically and also in terms of fairness, by virtue of being here. But I would slightly disagree with the fact that everyone understands that generalization cannot be taken for granted. That's not the experience I've had in talking to purely clinical side. So we've spoken to neuroradiologists who say brains are brains, the products have been CE marked, we should just be able to use it. Like, why not? So I don't think it is something that we can take for granted. And I think the concept of generalization, or AI not generalizing, is something we need to talk about a little bit more. And again, I think we're a very particular audience. It's not as commonplace from my experience in the places which are not research universities. You know, they want to bring in AI because they have a problem with workload. They don't have a big university department. They don't have a lot of radiologists. They just want to be able to deal with the workload. So I think they're both important, and local validation we know needs to be done, probably on the scanners as well as on the hospital sites, but it's still a bit of a challenge at the moment, I think.
Great point. And it's hard work doing the local validation, but it doesn't pay off in a way you can't easily publish it. I guess it's less appealing for academics to do. Sara, I would like to bring you in on that point regarding intended use that Kanwal just mentioned, and how regulation might play into this. So my question is the following: is there a risk that regulation could harm fairness in AI?
Oh, that's a tricky question.
It is.
Whether regulation can harm fairness. I mean,
let me maybe specify this a little bit. What would happen if AI vendors go through the subgroup performance analysis and find out there is a group where the product doesn't perform well, so they change their intended use and that's it?
Yeah, I think, I know where you are coming from now. I mean, first of all, I think like generally what we understand by fairness, I guess, is already like contested, and so it depends on what you are seeing as fairness and how you define fairness. But let's say we have a standard of how to measure that, and so regulators are using the same test of tools, etc. Then I do think, in general, I would agree with the chart you just showed that most want some legislation. I think it's good to have some minimum standard, but of course it needs to be flexible. So if you realize, okay, because there are some unconscious issues or biases which you might have not even realized when you brought it on the market, so there needs to be some mechanism that you can quickly update it and get rid of that issue. And so I think there needs to be a lot of thought, thinking through how to do that. So, but I think like so I think one needs to see it as a life cycle. So from a pre-market perspective, not showing anything right now, for example, how I showed in the US, that there's not enough disclosure, that's an issue, and that should change 100%. But then once it's on the market, we also need to have some mechanism in place for monitoring those issues, and don't take it for granted just because it has been checked by a regulator that this tool is now always fair for every subpopulation, because there are so many things which we cannot even anticipate it before we have used it in practice and used with different types of patients. So it's really, really hard to identify pre-market all of the issues which the algorithm will show later on. And so I think that is just something where everyone needs to be critical. And I think the point that Sanmi raised earlier, everyone needs to feel like a responsibility to work on those issues in the entire life cycle.
Great points. Regarding the responsibility, I would like to go back to Judy, who I know is working very hard on making data available and algorithms available, and in particular with the emphasis on them being used for these type of analysis. So when it comes to the data set descriptions, for example, and this picks up a question that came to one of the talks, do we care about the test data only on which the models are evaluated, or do we care about the training data as well that was used for model development?
So we've learned a lot, and we've learned a lot. Really the best way to build data sets is to combine their use and their building. So we take building data sets as one of our core functions. Every day we spend some time building this. I know that your team, Ben, attended the datathon, and just by them using the Emory data set, we learn a lot and about the pitfalls. Remember that the IRB in the strict sense says that you should not go back and re-identify a data set once you've released it. So if you think, what if you find another mistake? So for example, in the next year, we're going to have Embed 2, and Embed 2 is going to be a breast data set that combines ultrasound, MRI, and digital pathology scans. So then you can really say, when I'm trying to predict breast cancer, what's the true utility of this model? And so in our own experience, where you have this one-time data sets, and as you know, I've been very, very interested in looking at shortcuts, right? These subtle things that are embedded in the images that are not obvious to the radiologist, but we know that the model picks up on them, not just race, but even insurance, gender, sex. And if you sort of look at those components, and yet we know that the models fail on them, they learn those characteristics, and then when you remove one shortcut, it moves to another. It means that if I don't give you DICOM data where you can look at pixel information, then you're never going to really do this type of evaluation. And those have been lessons that we've learned in the real world setting. And So this partnership, and I'm going to sort of just put in a plan for people to look at the second Emory AI bias datathon. It's a really good place for people to come by, look at the data, and help us build better data sets. And so I'll tell you the one thing that surprised your team actually, Ben, was that they said, oh, the Black patients in Emory did better than the white patients. And it wasn't a mistake. And it was really because the Black patient in Atlanta is actually very well to do. They are not the same Black patient in somewhere else. And so if we're stamping all FDA algorithms that they work for Black patients, they don't work for all Black patients. And although that should not be the metric we're using, but it shows you the complexity and the real world challenge and why this should be a partnership as you move on and think about how to build data sets. We don't know, we're approaching this with a point of humility, but are learning from the people who are using our data sets early in the process.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think being exposed to this real world data, especially for PhD students in the computer science department, is wonderful, and seeing all these differences that, and also challenging a little bit kind of the assumptions you have. Now, from the data sets to the models, Sanmi, I wanted to ask you about the open source question. I mean, there's a lot of discussion currently about frontier AI and all the stuff that affects us in our daily life and what we see on social media. But when it comes to healthcare AI, do you have a thought about should we advocate open source? Is it good for transparency, or is it dangerous?
It's still a mixed bag. I don't think so. I'll just lay both sides and then maybe give my opinion on, I guess, my leaning on the sides of it. I think for research, for evaluation, for sort of testing unintended bad outcomes, it's very clear that the more you can see of the model, the better you can evaluate and test things, the better other people can build on the work. Like, all that is important, both the scholarship aspect, the safety aspect, all these things I think are quite meaningful. And I would advocate very strongly for this for most kinds of AI tools, actually. For healthcare, as you know, there's always this trickiness of privacy because it sort of directly ties to sort of individual information that's very sensitive. And we know that sort of a sufficiently sophisticated and motivated attacker can do a lot with a release model. And where we really are, like exactly where the risk is and how vulnerable we might be, I think is not yet fully cleared. Or, early works that should just show some vulnerability, but I think the full extent is not fully clear. My sense is sort of somewhere in the middle is probably the right mode right now, where we have protected release and along that agreements that minimize sharing and sort of some tracking of usage and things like that is probably the way to go. Again, mostly tied to the risk of privacy, but for every other reason, I think I'm a strong advocate for open sourcing everything.
Right, thank you. Kanwal, do you have any thoughts on the open source aspect? I don't know how it helps, like in your discussions with companies who want to validate data models and so on. Is that a thing at all that people discuss?
Yeah, and I think it is related to the question about training and test data sets as well. So I'm a big advocate for open source. I think, especially in the research community, it allows progress to be made. I know very few companies that would allow either their training data or their code to be open in the way that we expect in the research community. They view it as their IP. So you would not be able to see their code, you would not be able to see their training data. And that's why the importance, in my opinion, about testing is really, so test data sets become important if you can't see the training data sets as well. But I think, we should be encouraging open source as a rule. It's how we can make progress.
Great, thank you. Sara, I would like to get your view a little bit on a question that I think that was raised earlier by one of the attendees regarding, in the workshop, we talked a lot about algorithmic bias. We haven't talked a lot about human bias. And from a legal perspective, or generally also from a regulator's perspective, there's obviously the question to what standard do we hold AI, and to what standard do we already have, let's say, in the medical profession regarding biases? What are your thoughts on that?
It's a good question, and I think we haven't figured out where we put the threshold. Physicians are black boxes themselves. We don't know if you go to a physician, You don't know did this physician which information tools the physician used, where potentially and what implicit biases that physician has. We as humans just tend to, hold technology and AI tools to a higher threshold than a human, and so we expect from technology that it has no flaws often, and it is better. And so I think, like, especially in countries like the US or also Europe, we want AI want AI tools which are like highly accurate, and where the threshold is going to be put, that's currently depending kind of like literally the regulator, whether the FDA thinks that's like enough in sensitivity, specificity, etc. But I mean, if one thinks also about other countries where we have even lower income countries where we have not many physicians and like a shortage in physicians, some of the tools we already have developed and are as good as doctors will be very helpful there too. And I think in general we are forgetting sometimes those countries, and we should there should be more incentives to make AI happen there, because I think the AI tools we have could already make a good and a positive benefit for those countries. But of course, they struggle with other issues like infrastructure, and etc. But of course, through apps, I think like apps and mobile phones, that could be an avenue more than in the healthcare system and hospitals, where a lot is still paper-based. But I think we need to think more about those things, and also, develop for those local communities, and not just because there's a lot of contextual bias. You can't just develop a tool and then just transfer it to another country, or to another, even within one country, to another hospital. So some of those tools need to be revalidated. There's a lot of questions about resources and the cost of doing this, and how to and how to do that properly. So I think there are many questions which we still need to figure out and haven't.
Right, thank you. Maybe I can give that question to the clinician in the room. What do you think, Judy, about human biases and clinician biases?
So I have two thoughts. I'll first react to the last comment. I think a lot of people are calling from South Africa right now. A lot of people think AI can help the low and middle income countries. I think that's a fallacy. It's always done by more technical people who are not, it's very, very difficult. And new studies are showing that bad healthcare is worse than no healthcare in most of these places. I mean, my parents still live on the continent. And as we start to think about the next workforce in the next 10, 20 years, 1 in 4 people in the world is going to be from the African continent. It should be in supplementation. It should be scaling and acceleration. How do we not, the earlier work, like for the US, was focusing on replacing doctors, right? How do you not disrupt training? Because I'm having all my collaborators on the continent upload all their studies to Dropbox for me to read them. There has been security breaches. They're never talked about, but where there are weak regulatory efforts where patient privacy is protected. And so I think it's great and ambitious, and I do believe the technology will get there, but the practical way, and not removing ourselves from how technology is deployed, I think is a blind eye that has more potential for harm than good, is my high horse on that. Now, our clinicians' bias. Now, this is a very sensitive topic because we tend to think that we are good and fair, and we know maternal deaths. Black mothers die because mainly they're not hurt, even if they say they're bleeding. Big celebrities, irrespective of their education, irrespective of their amount of money they have almost died. Serena Williams, Beyonce, from maternal death, just because no one believes them. And so we are very biased. We don't want to talk about it that way. We like to think about ourselves. And there is quite a lot of movement about unconscious bias. As a patient, I was labeled, if you look at my EMR, I was labeled when I was expectant to be crazy. I actually think of myself as a very calm person. And it's just this one doctor that was couldn't really try to make a teaching case out of me. And it's easy to get on the wrong side. The clinicians don't like to think about themselves that way, or nurses, and you know, it's just a reality. And just in line with what Sanmi said, the people who build AI, that's also going to be more limited because people are not used to even seeing Black doctors. And now with the Supreme Court changes, we'll even see less Black doctors. And so it's a really tough place, but we are very biased. We don't like to talk about them. And if you find the bias in a system, you have to learn how to politically make everyone move towards the betterment of the patient, again, representing how difficult it is to work in this space.
Great, thank you, Judy, for those words. And I think that AI has become a political topic is very clear. We have executive orders. We have the AI Safety Summit recently in the UK, bringing together world leaders. And I think that there needs to be a discussion on all levels. I think this is a great point. Maybe to conclude this, I would just like to thank all our panelists so much, and also all our keynote speakers who are most of the panelists, and also all the contributor talks and the organizers and the attendees. We had a record number of attendees for this online workshop. This is fantastic to see that there's more and more interest in this topic, and I'm pretty sure the other organizers will join me to thank everyone, and we hope to see you again at the next iteration of FAIMI. Thanks everyone for joining.